Hello, good morning, Professor Chomsky. It is a pleasure to finally be able to meet with you after so many tries. This is a very informal interview that will be later on turned into an article for London Politica. So I will just briefly introduce you, even though you don't really need an introduction, and then we will proceed with the questions really quickly. So good morning, I am Alessia Mazuelos. I am a research analyst at London Politica. And today I have the pleasure and honor to hold an interview with Professor Chomsky, a very prominent intellectual on the United States foreign affairs topic. Noam Chomsky is a renowned philosopher, political activist, and prominent linguist, being a strong opponent of the US involvement in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. And that is why we're very interested to hear your thoughts on the current situation. So the first question is on a piece that you wrote for The Economist. You described the US foreign policy under unrivaled military and economic strength in an article for The Economist. You said that it was reflection of the cruelty of American imperialism and brought back the criticism on American exceptionalism, which you have mentioned before. How did you come to this conclusion? In your view, what do current events from Afghanistan withdrawal to NATO expansion and the Ukraine to even the US-China relations, what do the current events tell you of the United States power and their foreign policy?
Notice that those events happen to be mostly after the article, but the same conclusions follow. These are long-standing policies. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was carried out in a way which quite predictably, I can refer you to things I wrote beforehand, predictably wrote to total collapse of the shadow government, which had no backing, and most of the Afghan army, much of it didn't even exist. Ghost soldiers, of course, it collapsed. The US withdrew. The next step was to take control of Afghans' bank account, which happens to be in New York. There are literally tens of millions of people starving in Afghanistan, people who have money. There's food in the market. They can't go and take it out because they don't have a bank account. So they watch their children starve. The pretext, which makes it even worse, is that the US has to withhold the money because Americans might want compensation for 9/11, which Afghans had absolutely nothing to do with. Continuation, and virtually nobody's talking about it. Okay, so we'll kill tens of millions of Afghans because they dared to resist us. That's what it comes down to. Meanwhile, how is this treated in the United States? Well, the 20th anniversary of the invasion, there was considerable discussion of it. There was even one interview with the perpetrator of the invasion, George W. Bush. It was in the Washington Post. In the style section, it interviewed this, what they called a goofy grandpa playing with his grandchildren, showing off the pictures that he drew of famous people he met. Just a lovely scene, Well, that's after country was devastated. Who knows how many killed? Nobody knows. No new crimes. Then you go to the next subject. So that's Afghanistan. The second question you asked was about China, I think. Is that right? That's quite interesting. The United States, the Trump administration in 2018 did have a new national strategic policy. It was to be prepared to fight and win 2 wars simultaneously, one against China, one against Russia. So we have to build up our military strength to do that. A war against either would be the termination of the human species. Simple as that. There's no way to have a war against a nuclear power. But we have to be prepared to fight both of them simultaneously and to win. Winning is, of course, impossible. Well, you might think that that's a definition of insanity, except that it was topped by the Biden administration. When they came into office, they accepted the strategic analysis and posture, but extended it. We have to surround, they said, encircle China with what are called sentinel states. That's a ring of states from South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, India, if they can get India to join, doesn't want to join. And this ring of sentinel states will be, it already is equipped, but it'll have to be updated with more advanced weapons aimed at China, including precision weapons, backed by a fleet of nuclear submarines. A single US nuclear submarine, Trident submarine, can, according to the military, destroy almost 200 cities anywhere in the world. That's one submarine. But they're not powerful enough, so they're being replaced by more advanced Virginia-class submarines. So all this has to be aimed at China to counter what's called Chinese aggression. Well, what exactly is Chinese aggression? And where is Chinese aggression? A lot of rotten things about China, can criticize all kinds of things, but where is the Chinese aggression? In fact, the former Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, distinguished international statesman, in the Australian press, ran through this question, asked the question, what is the China threat? Of course, they're right in the claws of the dragon. And he ran through it, pointed out that, this repression in China, they're doing things they shouldn't be doing off their coast, South China Sea, but it's hardly a major problem. He said the threat of China is that China exists. That's correct. It exists, and it's not following US orders. It's not like Europe. It's not like Britain. It doesn't follow US orders. Well, for a global hegemon, that's not tolerable. So that's the China threat. So we have to prepare for war, major war, to counter this threat. That's another continuation of the normal policy. I should say that the United States is breaking no new ground on this. Its predecessor in imperial domination, Britain, was doing exactly the same things. France was doing the same in its smaller domains. This is standard imperial policy. There's a belief, there's a doctrine of US exceptionalism, which has 2 problems. For one thing, it disregards everything that's done. For another thing, it's not exceptional. Every other country was the same way. Go back to Britain, the worst moment of its most horrendous atrocities, leading figures were praising Britain as an absolutely angelic power. That's normal imperialism. So no exceptionalism, but the policies are right in front of our eyes. You mentioned Ukraine. Well, here it's quite interesting. If you think about the Ukrainian situation, just think about it for a minute. There's two ways for the war to end. One way is through a diplomatic settlement. The only other way is to reject the diplomatic settlement, in which case the war will go on until one side capitulates. And it's not going to be Russia. And so those are the options. US policy is explicit. No negotiations, no diplomacy. That was announced very clearly at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the US Air Base, where the US brought the NATO powers and others together, basically to lay down the law. The law was, we all believe that Ukraine can win the war, which is totally crazy. They're not going to defeat Russia. If Russia was ever facing defeat, they'd use the weapons that, of course, they have to wipe out Ukraine. So that's not going to happen. Maybe the military leaders believe it, but military leaders have believed a lot of things over the years. So that was the first point. Second point is no settlement until we harm Russia, and in fact, harm Russia so severely that it will never be able to undertake aggression again. Well, what does that mean? That means something stronger than the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty wasn't strong enough. Germany could conduct aggression again. So we have to impose on Russia a defeat more extreme than the Versailles Treaty. And they're just going to sit there and watch while we do it. I mean, this happens to be official policy. Well, how's the reaction in Europe? To cheer, especially in Britain. Cheer how wonderful it is. I mean, it's as if the political elite has gone insane.
Thank you very much for the response. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So first, I would like to go from the beginning, from your answer. So with Afghanistan, you did claim that there was an ulterior motive behind the United States. First of all, invasion, and then that so-called interest that had nothing to do with 9/11, but there was a sort of interest from what they claimed in attacking Iraq. And the moment they had the chance, they did so. They did so to show off their muscle, and that they cared little about the Afghan people and the costs of war. So in this way, do you think that the American foreign policy seems very opportunistic, almost intimidating and imperialistic under your view? Now that's the invasion part. With the withdrawal part, do they keep on with those same ideas, or do they no longer care about Afghanistan? Do they no longer see any strategic long-term gains from that, and that's why they withdrew?
Well, first of all, the phrase that you quoted, to show their muscle and intimidate everyone, I was quoting that. I was quoting it from the leading figure of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, Abdul Haq, actually in an interview he had in Britain right after the bombing started. After the bombing started, he was asked by Anatoliev, a specialist in the region, it was a long interview, what was attitude toward the US bombing. He said the bombing is killing many Afghans. It's undermining our efforts to overthrow the Afghan government with the Taliban government from within. And Yevhen asked, why are they doing it? He said they want to show their muscle and intimidate everyone. That's all. They don't care about the Afghans, or they're just killing. Well, he had pretty good backing for that. When the US had no reason to invade. At the time, if you look back, they didn't even know that Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. In fact, 8 months after the invasion, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, had his first major press conference, and he was asked who's responsible for 9/11. He said, well, we're investigating. We suspect it's Al-Qaeda, but we really don't know, have no evidence yet. That was 8 months after the invasion, which meant that when they invaded, they didn't know, of course. So why'd they invade? Well, the only answer I've ever heard is Abdul Haq, to show their muscle and intimidate everyone. In fact, it goes on. A couple of weeks after the bombing started, the Taliban offered to surrender, which would have meant giving over Al-Qaeda, bin Laden. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, responded by saying, we do not negotiate surrenders. The president then repeated that we don't negotiate surrenders. And Bush was later asked, what do you know about Al-Qaeda? He said, we really don't care very much, not paying attention. I don't think there was any ulterior motive. There's no strategic motive. In fact, it deterred the invasion of Iraq. There was, of course, a motive for the invasion of Iraq. That's a real prime target. But Afghanistan was of no interest to them. And when they withdrew, still of no interest. And if we kill a couple of million Afghans, too bad, it's not our problem.
Yeah, that definitely answers my question. So there is no real ulterior strategic motive for Afghanistan. There was no interest at all. Just moving on with, before I go in depth with China, because I wanted to ask afterwards a little bit about Taiwan and how that ties into the US involvement in the world, in the foreign policy. I wanted to ask before that about NATO and the United States, leadership with NATO. I believe that you mentioned Anatol Lieven's zombie policy when it comes to the American objectives in front of Minsk, and even tying to the current Ukraine war, the invasion from Russia. You narrated how in 2014 a Russian-oriented Ukrainian government was replaced by a US and Europe-oriented one, and this was done through a coup. Not many talk about this that happened back in 2014, and this then led to the Crimean conflict. How do you think that this current war can be managed then or resolved? I know that you mentioned the two possibilities of how it will end. Knowing that maybe the stubbornness or the role of the United States with NATO and seeking to expand NATO could be the dead strategy or the zombie foreign policy that the US is trying to seek. Could the US backing away from this handle a more diplomatic settlement, as you mentioned, could be the end? Or does Putin not really care about the United States and NATO?
First of all, the comment from Anatol Lieven about the zombie policy was before the invasion. Said the United States doesn't have a coherent policy. Well, now there is a policy. Now, the policy is to block diplomacy. I just quoted it. You can look at the words. The way that's been described, for example, by a high-ranking US ambassador, Charles Freeman, highly respected. He said the US seems to want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. That's what's going to happen if there's no settlement. Well, that's the policy. It's part of it. Actually, there's a description of it. It's called the Afghan model. That's referring to the 1980s when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And we now have a we have two versions of what happened. There's the US government version, and there's the definitive study by the leading individuals who supervised what in fact happened. Diego Cordovez, who was the UN ambassador who negotiated the withdrawal, Zelig Harrison, leading scholar, analyst, joint book that came out where they describe what happened. And it's quite, as they point out, it's different from the official story. What happened is, here the United States agrees, the United States drew the Russians in to what was called an Afghan trap. That's Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor for President Carter. He convinced Carter to send weapons to the opposition to the Russian-supported government in Afghanistan, expecting that that would draw the Russians in. And Brzezinski was delighted the Russians did enter, intending to carry out a temporary intervention to support the government. Then the US rounded up the most rabid Islamic radicals it could find anywhere in the world to try to keep the war going, to keep the Russians in. The official goal was, quoting, kill Russians. In other words, harm Russia as much as possible. Keep them in there and prevent negotiations. That was explicit, because we want to keep them in there. And finally, the UN did act effectively to negotiate a withdrawal over US objections. Now, Brzezinski was asked afterwards whether he thought this was a correct policy to draw the Russians in, kill a lot of Russians, and of course, wreck Afghanistan. His answer was, of course it was the correct policy. Yes, he said, it will leave a few agitated Muslims, it's his phrase, release some agitated Muslims, including 1 million cadavers, but it'll harm the Russians. So it's of course the right thing to do. Well, that's US policy from the National Security Advisor. But if you look at what actually happened, it is a kind of a model for what's going on now. Cordovez and Harrison described the policy in their words as fighting Russia to the last Afghan. That's their phrase. Pretty much what happened, pretty much what the US is now insisting on today with regard to Ukraine. Of course, it's a criminal invasion. Nobody questions that. It's a war crime like US invasion of Iraq, others. But what do we do about it? Well, again, we're back to elementary logic. Either you have a diplomatic settlement or you don't. Nobody can debate that. If you have a diplomatic settlement, by definition, it means neither side likes it much, but both are willing to tolerate it. That's a diplomatic settlement by definition. If you don't want, anybody who talks about that is accused of appeasement. In other words, that's a roundabout way of saying, let's ensure that the war goes on indefinitely, because that's the only logical alternative. If you want to scream and yell, okay, forget logic. But if you care at all about Afghans, you won't forget logic, or Ukrainians in this case. If you care about them, you will pay attention to the logic of the situation, look at the alternatives, see what the possible outcomes are. That's pretty straightforward. A diplomatic settlement, as Yevin and Graham Fuller, former CIA agent, and others have been saying for a long time, diplomatic settlement means Putin has some kind of escape hatch. Otherwise, there's no diplomatic settlement. If he has no escape hatch, he'll go for broke, use the weapons he has, devastate Ukraine, much worse. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is to accept the diplomatic settlement. That means an ugly settlement. It's not the kind you'd like. There's no justice, but this is international affairs. It's not a morality play.
Thank you very much for that response. Definitely, we will see what will happen, whether a diplomatic settlement happens or not. We know what the U.S. position is on that. So just as the final point that you mentioned on China, we don't really know what the Chinese question is, what the Chinese threat could be. The U.S. has claimed for it to be the most significant long-term threat. This could tie to the fact that it could mark an end to the liberal world order if China eventually surpasses the US, if that were to ever happen. What is your opinion on the United States' role and actions to the rising tensions of China in Taiwan? The possibility for China to invade. Some argue that this could be Ukraine repeated. What do you think about China in Taiwan?
You raised two questions. They're separate. One is about Taiwan. One is about the threat of China surpassing the United States. Let's take Taiwan. There is a position that's been held for almost 50 years. It's ambiguous, but it's worked. It's called the One China policy. The US agrees that Taiwan is part of China, but both sides agree we're not going to do anything about it. Okay, that's held for 50 years. It's not great. But if you can think of a better one, I'd like to hear it. That's the best proposal I've heard. Held for 50 years, can continue. If the US takes provocative actions, China will retaliate with provocative actions, could blow up. I don't think China wants an invasion, and the US certainly shouldn't. So the best thing to do is just keep the pretense. Say, yeah, theoretically it's part of China, but we're not going to do anything about it. That's the best answer I know for Taiwan. Well, what about the threat that China will surpass the United States? What kind of threat is that exactly? I mean, if China advances, let's say it develops advanced solar panels, they happen to be way ahead of the United States. Is that a threat to the United States? We should be cheering it. We should be cooperating with China to ensure that not only the two countries, but the rest of the world can benefit from the cooperation. To say that it's a threat that they may surpass us is lunacy. And unfortunately, it is operative lunacy. Let's take a look at what just happened in Congress. You probably know this, but in the United States is destroying itself from the inside in all sorts of ways. This morning, there was another example. This morning, the Supreme Court determined, they didn't put it this way, but it's what it amounts to. They determined that the United States is such a crazy society that everyone must have the right to carry a concealed weapon for self-defense. That's a way of saying society is off in outer space. Can you think of another society where you have to carry a weapon for self-defense? Well, that's the Supreme Court this morning, okay? And it's not totally inaccurate. The country is collapsing internally. That's not a Chinese threat. One of the kinds of collapse is that the infrastructure is collapsing. The bridges are collapsing, the roads don't work, there's no broadband. My wife's family in Brazil has 5G broadband. In Arizona, I can't get it because they don't have it. There's a lot of internal problems. So Congress did, the Republicans usually vote against anything, but they did vote in favor of one bill. It's called the China Competition Bill. It's a bill to spend money to reconstruct US infrastructure and to provide money for research and development. In other words, to get the Republican Party to vote for what the country really needs, you have to present it as a China competition bill. Well, what does that tell you about the country? This is a problem not for the United States, it's for the whole world. That party is coming back into office in November in Congress. They already control the Supreme Court. They can nullify anything that the executive branch does until they take it over. This is the most powerful state in human history. What it does determines, has an enormous effect on everything in the world. We're not talking about Andorra. We're talking about the most powerful state in human history, where the Supreme Court has just told us a couple of hours ago that the country is totally insane. We're talking about a country where the party that's going to control the government will not pass a bill to help the American people unless it's a China competition bill, because of the threat that China might overtake us. I mean, maybe you can find words to describe this. It's beyond me.
That definitely, you touched on a topic that this for my understanding, it ties with the democratic crisis that the US has been uh, going through internally in domestic politics. And that makes me wonder, and this would be the last question for the interview. Do you think that the end of the United States global hegemony, or the US as a superpower, has more to do with, and here I'm quoting or sort of drawing in, alluding to John Mearsheimer's prediction of the revival of Russia and the rise of China? Does that have to do with the end of the US as a global superpower and the end of the liberal world? Or is it more what you mentioned, of the United States self-destructing, self-destroying, and this has to do with what is going on in domestic politics?
It's self-destruction in any objective sense. US global domination should be able to continue indefinitely. I mean, the US has enormous advantages that no other country has. Where else can you travel 3,000 miles and you think you're in the same country? Enormous material advantages, scale, homogeneity, resources. It's got extraordinary security, nothing like it in history. Controls the Western Hemisphere, controls both oceans, controls the opposite sides of both oceans for the most part. Nothing like that ever. China income. Russia is a declining kleptocracy. It has an enormous amount of minerals, has weapons, but aside from that, it's a wreck. It can become an adjunct of China, where it will provide minerals and resources for the growing Chinese system. But China is not a potential global hegemon. It has enormous problems internally. Take this morning's paper. One area of China is being crushed by enormous floods. Another area of China, the temperature's gone so high it literally reached 165 degrees Fahrenheit. It has enormous ecological problems, has demographic problems, has security problems, of course. Take a look at the encirclement, and a half war with India. It's nowhere. Just take a look at military force. I mean, the US is so far ahead, you can't even calculate it. It's in per capita terms, which is what counts, it's probably it's about 20 times beyond China. You look at the numbers. China has one military base in Djibouti. The United States has 800. There's furor in Washington now because China's threatening to have a second military base in the Solomon Islands. So we have to tremble in fear. I mean, the way this is discussed it's almost indescribable. It's actually, this goes way back. And Britain was very similar. Can't permit anything to, in fact, if you go back to the American Revolution, King George III was upset, concerned that if the colonies succeed in the revolt, it'll lead to a dissolution of the British Empire, because others will follow the example and the whole system will erode. Well, that's imperial mentality. It's very much like the mafia. The Godfather really doesn't care in economic terms if some storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, but he's not going to let him get away with it because you can't permit that idea to exist. You have to follow orders. If you don't, we're going to crush you. That's probably the major principle of international affairs. A lot of fancy talk, but that's what it comes down to. Then you see case after case. Well, that's why the United States regards it as a threat if China advances economically.
Well, thank you very much for the response. I would say that at the beginning of the interview, I thought something, and by the end of this, I have changed. You have really implanted some doubts in my original view of what would happen, and I didn't really know much of everything you mentioned on how really the United States is self-destroying itself. I believe that seeing as nowadays more people are talking about that, perhaps that will make most scholars change their minds on what is really going to be the end of the US as a global superpower, or not really the end of the US as a global superpower, as you mentioned. It's almost indefinite. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for this interview.